Have you ever felt like the invisible one in your own family? Like you were only invited to the table when there was a check that needed signing? I'm asking because I used to be that person, and one day I finally decided to stop footing the bill. My name is Kayla, and I'm 32 years old. I work as a senior director of financial risk analysis in Boston, spending my days analyzing global market volatility and managing multi-million-dollar hedge fund portfolios. I'm trained to spot cracks in foundations before entire skyscrapers come tumbling down. But somehow, I never saw the disaster growing inside my own childhood home. Or maybe I just didn't want to look. It all came to a head on one ordinary November afternoon when my mom called to tell me the whole family was coming for Thanksgiving. But there was a catch. "This year is about your sister," she said. "So do not ruin it." Within hours, my sister Madison texted me directly, "Do not come. The guest list is final." I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I simply accepted an out-of-state transfer in Boston that I'd turned down for years just to stay close to them. 1 week later, my dad called in a panic. "We're changing the locks on the house," he said. What he didn't realize was that he was changing the locks on a house that I owned. Standing in my corner office on the 45th floor, I watched the first Boston snow blanket the city in cold, unforgiving white. The silence of that room was expensive, the kind of quiet you only get when the glass is thick enough to drown out the entire world. On my mahogany desk sat a leather-bound folder containing my personal balance sheet. It wasn't pretty, but not for the reasons you might think. For 10 years, I had been the silent investor in my family's version of happiness. I was the one who paid for groceries when my dad Jeffrey's pension ran dry. I covered the property taxes when foreclosure notices started arriving like vultures at the door. 5 years ago, I quietly bought the coastal mansion from the bank, signing mountains of paperwork just to ensure my parents would never have to pack a box. I told them it was a trust arrangement. I let them keep their dignity while I carried the debt. But to them, I wasn't a savior. I was the cold corporate workaholic who didn't understand family values. I was the spinster daughter who traded a husband and kids for a high-rise office and a spreadsheet. My mother Deborah was a master of the whisper campaign. She'd call our relatives and sigh about how sad it was that I was so obsessed with money, all while she was using my credit card to buy organic truffles and silk scarves. Then there was Madison, my 26-year-old influencer sister who lived in a world of filters and fake smiles. She was the golden child, the one whose every breath was treated like a miracle. She was having a gender reveal party, and apparently my presence made things tense because I asked too many questions. Questions like, how is Caleb going to pay for a nursery when he hasn't closed a real estate deal in 18 months? The audacity of it was almost impressive. They wanted my house. They wanted the $5,000 I'd already wired for catering and custom floral arrangements. But they didn't want me. I was the bank. And the bank doesn't get invited to the party, it only gets the bill. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon the old familiar sting of rejection, but it wouldn't come. The hurt had been replaced by something much sharper: clarity. In the world of risk management, when an asset becomes a liability that threatens the entire portfolio, you don't try to fix it. You liquidate it, you cut your losses, and you walk away. I sat back in my chair and pulled up my banking app. It was time to stop playing the part of the daughter who was never enough. If I was going to be the villain in their story, I might as well be the most efficient one they'd ever met. This wasn't a breakdown, this was a balance sheet, and the Harrison family was officially in the red. I pulled up the primary household account for the Seattle property, the one they called home, but I called Asset 42. For 10 years, I'd been the silent provider, the one who made sure the lights stayed on and the water stayed hot without ever asking for a thank you. I realized now that I hadn't been helping them. I'd been trapping them in a reality that didn't exist. Kindness without boundaries is poison for the recipient. In risk management, we call it moral hazard. When you insulate someone from the consequences of their own actions, they don't become grateful. They become reckless. They become predators. By paying every bill and absorbing every debt, I hadn't been a good daughter. I'd been an enabler, building a reinforced cage of comfort that allowed their narcissism to thrive. I was the one who'd funded the very weapons they were now using to cut me out of their lives. It was time to initiate the extraction. I started with the small things, the invisible threads that kept their luxury lifestyle from fraying. I logged into the premium cable and internet portal. Account holder, Kayla Harrison. Status, active. I clicked through to the Service Management tab and selected Immediate Disconnection. No more high-definition streaming for Madison's influencer research. No more sports packages for Jeffrey to ignore the world. Next was the landscaping and pool maintenance. I'd been paying $800 a month to keep that backyard looking like a Pinterest board so Madison could film her outfit of the day videos in the natural sunlight. I canceled the contract effective immediately. If they wanted a pristine garden for their reveal party, they could grab a shovel themselves. Then came the utilities. Seattle in late November is unforgiving, and the forecast was calling for a record-breaking freeze. I stared at the button for the natural gas and electricity services. For a second, a flicker of the old Kayla, the one who worried about her mother's comfort, tried to stay my hand. But then I remembered the text. The guest list is final. You are bad luck. My compassion had been a luxury they'd overdrafted for years, and the account was officially closed. I clicked submit on the disconnect orders. The system confirmed that services would be terminated within 48 hours, right in time for the big party. I opened a new spreadsheet. At the top, I typed, the price of silence. I started pulling records from the last decade. $14,000 for Madison's photography equipment that she used for 3 weeks. $60,000 for the kitchen remodel. Deborah insisted she needed to host family gatherings I was eventually banned from. $85,000 for the down payment that kept them from the street in 2019. As the numbers added up, the total climbed past $1,200,000. I stared at the final figure. It was the price of a life I had never been allowed to live. I'd been the engine of their dreams while they treated me like the exhaust. I didn't feel angry as I watched the cursor blink. I felt light. I felt like a captain finally throwing the dead weight overboard to save the ship. I was no longer footing the bill for a family that viewed me as a transaction. I was reclaiming my equity. That night, I didn't check the family group chat. I didn't look for an apology. I just watched the snowfall and realized that for the first time in my life, I wasn't responsible for the weather in Seattle. 48 hours later, the silence of my Boston office was shattered. My phone didn't just ring. It screamed. The caller ID showed Jeffrey, my father. I didn't answer. I watched it vibrate across the desk until it went quiet, only for it to light up again 2 seconds later. This time, it was my mother. Then Madison. They were calling in a rotating cycle, a desperate relay race of people who had finally hit the wall I'd built. I let the 5th call go to voicemail and waited. When I finally hit play, my father's voice was a jagged mess of confusion and rage. Kayla, what the hell is going on? The house is pitch black. Your mother was in the middle of a bath and the water just stopped. Madison is having a meltdown because the Wi-Fi is out and she has a brand deal to post. Fix this now. Fix this. Those were the 2 words that had defined my relationship with them for a decade. It was the command they gave their personal servant. I didn't call back. Instead, I opened my laptop and refreshed the private investigator's portal. Mike, the investigator I'd hired, had been busy. As I scrolled through the new images, a cold, clinical disgust washed over me. There were photos of Caleb, my supposedly mogul brother-in-law, at a suburban park in Chicago. He wasn't alone. He was pushing a stroller. Beside him was a woman who was definitely not Madison. They looked happy. They looked like a family. Then came the financial records. Caleb had been running a textbook Ponzi scheme, funneling money from investors, mostly friends of my parents, into a shell company. But the money wasn't staying there. He was using the funds Madison earned from my credit card stipends to pay for a secret mortgage in Illinois. My sister wasn't just an accomplice. She was the bankroll for her husband's double life, and she was too blinded by her own influencer ego to see it. The toxic family dynamic was a masterpiece of theater. Deborah would play the victim, Jeffrey would act as the enforcer, and Madison would provide the distraction with her perfect life, all while Caleb picked everyone's pockets. They'd spent years isolating me, whispering to the extended family that I was unstable and jealous, creating a buffer so that if I ever tried to tell the truth, no one would believe me. Madison had even posted a video an hour ago using her phone's data. It was a close-up of her face, lit by a single candle, looking frazzled but brave. She told her followers that her bitter, wealthy sister had cut off their power in a fit of rage just to ruin her baby's reveal. The comments were a bloodbath of people calling me a monster. I watched the view count climb and felt nothing. No heat, no hurt, just the calm satisfaction of a risk analyst who knows the market is about to crash. Madison wanted to be an influencer. Fine. I was about to give her the kind of viral exposure you cannot recover from. I didn't call the family to argue. I didn't defend myself against the lies. I simply packaged the investigator's file. The photos of the secret family, the forged documents, the embezzlement trail, and sent a carbon copy to my family law attorney and the King County Sheriff's Department. Emotion is just bad data in an audit. I deleted it. I looked at the candle flickering in Madison's video and thought about the darkness currently swallowing my house in Seattle. They thought they'd changed the locks on me. They didn't realize I was the one who owned the air they were breathing. The legal file sitting on my desk was more than just a report. It was an autopsy of a betrayal. My lawyer called me at 3 in the afternoon. Her voice sounding like a sharpened blade. Kayla, we found the conduit, she said. Caleb didn't just stumble into the idea of using your house as collateral. Your father, Jeffrey, gave him the original deed from the safe. I felt a coldness settle in my chest that had nothing to do with the Boston winter. My father, the man I'd saved from bankruptcy, the man whose dignity I'd protected for 5 years, had handed the keys to my kingdom to a common thief. Jeffrey had signed a document that authorized Caleb to act as a representative for the family estate. It was a lie a legal fiction, but it was enough to trick a predatory hard money lender into drafting $1 million contract. Toxic family dynamics are like a slow-moving virus. They don't just attack one person, they infect the entire system. Deborah hadn't just been a passive observer, she'd been the one whispering in Jeffrey's ear that I was hoarding the family's wealth. She convinced him that Caleb was the son he never had, the one who would finally make the Harrison name mean something again. They weren't just ungrateful, they were actively plotting to strip me of the only asset I had left to my name. My sister Madison was the final piece of the puzzle. While she was filming those candlelit TikToks about her cruel sister, she was hiding the fact that she'd already spent $40,000 of the investment money on a luxury nursery that wasn't even in the house I owned. She knew Caleb had another family, she knew he was a fraud, but she chose the lie because the lie had a better aesthetic for her followers. I didn't waste time on an emotional confrontation. I didn't call them to ask why. Instead, I took the forged documents and the private investigator's report and walked into the office of Ironclad Acquisitions. They were a firm known for one thing. They buy problems that no one else wants to touch. The CEO looked at the deed and the evidence of the forgery. "This is messy," he said, a predatory smile spreading across his face. "You're looking at a loss of at least $300,000 if we take this off your hands today." "Make it $500,000, I replied, my voice steady. "I want the cash today, and I want the eviction process to start tomorrow morning. I don't want a court date, I want a clean break." He leaned back, impressed. "Most people cannot pull the trigger on their own family, Kayla." I looked him in the eye. "They're not family, they're a bad debt that's been on my books for too long. I'm just balancing the accounts." I signed the deed transfer right there. I sold the coastal mansion for $1,800,000, well below market value. But the price of my freedom was worth every cent. By the time I walked out of that office, the house on Maple Drive didn't belong to me anymore. It belonged to a company that specialized in hostile removals. I checked my phone one last time. A final text from Madison. "You're going to regret this, Kayla. Everyone hates you." I didn't reply. I just thought about the bright orange notice to vacate that was currently being printed. They wanted me to leave them alone. I was finally giving them exactly what they asked for. The sun had not even broken over the Seattle skyline when the heavy black SUVs of Ironclad Acquisitions rolled into the driveway of 42 Maple Drive. In Boston, I was already 3 hours into my workday, my eyes fixed on the live security feed from the house, a feed the family didn't know still existed because I was the one paying the cloud storage subscription. Through the grainy lens of the doorbell camera, I watched the lead contractor, a man who looked like he'd been carved out of granite, slap the bright orange writ of possession against the mahogany door. The sound of the staple gun was like a starter pistol. This was the moment the debt was finally called in. Inside, I saw the motion sensors trigger. My father, Jeffrey, stumbled into the foyer in his bathrobe, rubbing his eyes. Behind him, Madison was clutching a silk robe, her face pale without the ring light and filters. I watched through the speaker as the contractor spoke, his voice a low mechanical rumble. "You have 10 minutes to gather essential items. This property has been liquidated. You are currently trespassing on the private assets of Ironclad Acquisitions." "But we live here," Jeffrey shrieked, his voice cracking with a desperation I'd never heard. "My daughter owns this house." The contractor didn't even look up from his clipboard. "Correction. Kayla Harrison sold this property at 4:02 p.m. yesterday. You are no longer tenants. You are biological debris. Move or be moved." It was a bloodbath of reality. Within minutes, the front lawn was littered with the artifacts of their parasitic existence. I watched as movers in gray coveralls carried out the velvet throne Madison had rented for her reveal party. They didn't treat it with care. They tossed it onto the wet grass like the trash it was. My mother, Deborah, was screaming at a deputy, her mink coat flapping in the wind, but the officer just stared at the horizon. Then came the moment that made the $500,000 loss feel like a bargain. Caleb, my supposed mogul brother-in-law, didn't stay to fight while his pregnant wife was sobbing on the curb. I watched him on the back alley camera. He was clutching a leather messenger bag, the one where my mother kept the family jewelry. He didn't look back. He didn't offer Madison a hand. He scrambled into his leased Mercedes and tore down the alley, leaving the people who had championed him to face the winter alone. I watched Madison realize it in real time. She dialed his number over and over, her thumb shaking against the screen, but Caleb was already gone, heading toward the secret life he'd built with my money. She collapsed onto a pile of garbage bags, the influencer mask finally shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. I felt a twinge in my chest, the ghost of the daughter I used to be. But then I looked at my balance sheet. I looked at the 10 years of invisible labor, the $1 million of wasted kindness, and the text that said I was bad luck. The contractor looked directly into the camera lens, knowing I was watching. "Perimeter secured," he mouthed. He pulled a heavy steel deadbolt from his bag and began to drill into the frame. The high-pitched whine of the metal was the most beautiful song I'd ever heard. They wanted to change the locks. Fine. Now they were on the right side of them. By the time the sun fully climbed over the Seattle skyline, the neighborhood had turned into a theater of the absurd. I watched through the security feed as my mother, Deborah, desperately tried to stop a mover from carrying out a crate of her antique crystal. She was shrieking about heritage and respect, but the man didn't even look at her. He just adjusted his grip and kept walking. Jeffrey, my father, was sitting on the curb next to a stack of water-damaged encyclopedias. His head in his hands, he looked small. He looked like exactly what he was, a man who'd gambled away his daughter's loyalty for a con man's empty promises. Then came the moment that felt like the final clink of a closing vault. Madison, clutching her silk robe against the biting wind, realized the silver Mercedes was gone. She was screaming Caleb's name into her phone, her thumb frantic against the screen, but he'd already blocked her. He didn't just leave her, he left her with the debt, the shame, and the looming shadow of the fraud he'd committed in her name. Watching her collapse onto the wet pavement was supposed to hurt. I waited for that old familiar pull in my gut, the one that always compelled me to fly across the country and fix their messes. But it never came. Instead, I felt a profound clinical silence. This was the end of the line for the Harrison family dynasty. They'd spent years treating me like a backup generator, something they only valued when their own power failed. Well, the generator was gone. I'd uninstalled myself from their grid. I watched the foreman from Ironclad Acquisitions walk through the empty rooms of the house I used to call home. He was checking the walls, nodding to his team. To him, it wasn't a crime scene of a murdered childhood. It was just a double lot in a prime zip code that would be leveled by Monday. By the time the neighbors finished their morning coffee, my family was effectively homeless, standing on the sidewalk of a street where they no longer belonged. I closed the laptop lid. The glow of the screen faded, and for the first time in 10 years, the air in my Boston office felt light. I didn't feel like a monster. I felt like a woman who had finally stopped paying the ransom for a love that was never going to be returned. The balance sheet was finally at zero. I stood by the window of my new apartment in Chicago, watching the sun dip below the horizon of Lake Michigan. The water was a vast, deep indigo, reflecting the city lights that were just beginning to flicker on. For the first time in a decade, my shoulders weren't knotted with tension. There was no impending disaster to manage, no fire to put out, and no bill waiting in my inbox that didn't belong to me. The silence in my head was absolute. It was the silence of a ledger that had finally balanced to zero. That night, I sat down at my kitchen island with a glass of wine and opened my old personal laptop. I navigated to a folder I'd kept for years, one simply titled Family. Inside was the spreadsheet I'd maintained, the one that tracked the $1,200,000 I'd poured into people who eventually traded me for a gender reveal party and a new set of locks. I stared at the numbers for a long time. I thought about the vintage Rolex I'd bought for my father, the Chanel bag for my mother, and the endless stipends that had funded Madison's fake life. I felt a surge of what I thought might be regret. But as I breathed in the clean, quiet air of my new home, I realized it was actually something else. It was the finality of a bad investment. I selected the file. My finger hovered over the trackpad for a fraction of a second. Then I clicked delete. The computer asked if I was sure I wanted to permanently remove the data. I didn't hesitate. I clicked yes. The file vanished. And with it, the last tether of guilt that had kept me anchored to their dysfunction. Kindness without boundaries is truly a trap. When you stop being a parachute for people who refuse to learn how to fly, you don't just save yourself. You finally give them the chance to feel the ground. Whether they learn to walk on it or not is no longer your department. My phone buzzed on the counter. I didn't even flinch. It was a local Chicago number, my new colleague asking about a strategy meeting for Monday morning. I replied with a quick professional text and set the phone face down. Your silence is sometimes the most powerful answer for toxic people. You don't need a final confrontation. You don't need them to admit they were wrong. You just need to stop playing the game. Peace is expensive. It cost me a house and a family. But as I watched the moon rise over the lake, I knew it was the best deal I'd ever made. When you finally stop making yourself small so that others can feel big, the world suddenly becomes a much wider place. You're allowed to walk away. You're allowed to be happy. What's one boundary you need to set today to reclaim your peace? Tell me your story in the comments. I'd love to hear how you're choosing yourself. If this story resonated with you, please hit share and leave a heart below.